From Arctic ice to frozen Kiev streets, two crises, one superpower, as Trump demands Greenland be given back and threatens allies with tariffs. Ukraine's capital shivers in darkness under Russia's winter blitz, while Miami hosts secret peace talks. Moscow seizes territory and targets nuclear-linked grids. Is this diplomacy or desperation? Tonight, the high-stakes gamble shaping Europe's fate. I'm Helen Hamalawi. Let's get in focus. The United States is threatening tariffs on countries that have sent troops to Greenland, a move that sharply escalates President Donald Trump's push to acquire the Danish territory, despite firm rejection from both Denmark and Greenland. According to the Washington Post, Trump wrote on Truth Social, "After centuries, it is time for Denmark to give back. World peace is at stake." Britain, France, Germany, Norway, Sweden, Finland and the Netherlands have announced plans to deploy troops to Greenland for joint exercises with Denmark. Copenhagen and Greenland's leaders say that Washington is welcome to deepen security and economic ties, but insists that the island is not for sale. The newspaper adds that the confrontation risks the deepest rift in transatlantic relations, indicates raising NATO concerns that it could embolden Russia and China. For more on this, joins us from London, Mr. Meher Nicholas Fursley, Director of the EU ASEAN Centre. Welcome, sir, and let me start by asking you. Now, President Donald Trump mentioned it is time for Denmark to give back. Does the administration view NATO alliances as transactional, where territory can be traded for past security support?
I'm delighted to join you today, Hala.
Always a pleasure.
I think, first, my interns always remind me, I have to say, when discussing sensitive issues, that everything I say is a reflection of my personal perspective on current events. So that is done. Now, that being said, I don't like the word transactional. I'll tell you why. Because it could give the impression that, the Europeans are pure idealists, always honest, always on the side of peace and justice, and that Trump is some kind of greedy merchant, right? And I don't agree with that. Everyone is transactional.
It's just politics.
Yeah.
And interests playing around.
The difference is Trump is blunt, and in a way, one could say he's much more blunt than the Russian nationalists and the Chinese communists, because he doesn't try to put a painting or varnish of, flowery ideology. So, for the Chinese, it's about progress. The Europeans...
So you're saying this happens everywhere, just Trump doesn't use the sweet-talking quote, if we may say.
Yeah, it happens every day. And here there's a double standard, and there's a cruel double standard, because, once again, without taking sides, but, let's look at, for example, at the West Bank and Gaza Strip, right? There is the international law, what the Europeans, the Europeans and the Brits, every day, they say that they believe in a rules-based order. What does it mean? When they say we in London, Paris, Berlin, we believe in a rules-based order, it's a way of mocking or criticizing the Americans, the Russians, and the Chinese, implying that only the white, blonde, the blue-eyed Scandinavians and Germans believe in the rules-based system, and the others believe in the law of the jungle. It is not true. It's beautiful. It's a nice story, but it's not true. Because let's look at the West Bank and Gaza Strip. For example, there is international law exemplified, embodied in the highest form of international law, which is United Nations resolutions. And no one in London or Frankfurt or Paris has ever thought on knocking on the doors of Prime Minister Netanyahu and his predecessors and telling him, wait a minute, we believe in the rules-based order. Therefore, ipso facto, no one is doing it. So there is a double standard.
I get your point on double standards, but I'm interested more, Mr. Frizzly, on Greenland. Now, is this really about Greenland's strategic value, or is Trump testing how far he can push U.S. allies without consequences?
So I think it's about strategy. It's about, so I like the expression strategic value. It's very true, and it's spot on. So there's a new great game. And what is the new great game? What was the old great game? So the old great game was a game played by two superpowers 100 years ago. And it was a game played by Russia and England. But today, Russia is no longer a superpower, and Britain or England isn't a superpower either. And Europe, with all due respect to Emmanuel Macron and his friends, France and the European Union are not superpowers at all. There are only two superpowers left in the world, and they're fighting for geo-economic supremacy. What does
US
it mean?
and China.
Yes. What does it mean, geo-economic supremacy? They are not, if you notice, Beijing and Washington are not lobbing cruise missiles and bomb at each other like the Ukrainians and the Russians. And the reasons why the Europeans, the Ukrainians, the Russians are lobbing cruise missiles at each other every day is because they're losers. Why are they losers? Because they are fighting yesterday's war. What is today's war? What is the war of the future?
Technology and information.
Technology, information,
artificial intelligence.
And finance.
And finance.
So this is the meaning of geoeconomics. And then you have strategic sectors. You're right. You have like slicing and dicing the world economy into 9 or 10 gigantic industrial or economic sectors. And one of them is modern transportation infrastructure. So this is really vital for China and America, and they're fighting to the death. Who controls modern transportation infrastructure? And guess what? Of course, Greenland. That gigantic, Northwest Passage, the famous Northwest Passage connecting Western Europe, New York City, Montreal, to Asia through the Arctic route. Of course, it's vital. And this is the main reason, it's the number one reason why military planner and strategic thinkers in Washington, they care about Greenland. And the number two, far behind, the number two reason is rare earth minerals. And number three, below rare earth minerals, you have
earth minerals used in technology, chips, and of course, armaments.
Yes. And below that, far below, there is the natural gas and oil reserves in Greenland. So the Europeans, they get everything wrong, but there's something the Europeans get wrong. I don't want to sound cynical, but I will say it anyway. So what is the surface of Greenland? The overall surface of Greenland is something, I think, like 2 million square meters, right? 2 million square meters. What is the overall population of Greenland? It's 50,000 inhabitants. So you have 50,000 inhabitants, 2 million square meters. What does it mean? It means, I'm sorry, Ursula von der Leyen, and I'm sorry, Emmanuel Macron, but it means that 99.9% of Greenland is empty. It doesn't belong to anyone, because it's empty land. It's a huge tract of land. 99.9% is empty. Less than 0.01% is occupied by Denmark. And guess what? Denmark is an occupying colonial power, because look at the map. Denmark is very far from Greenland. Look at the people in Greenland. They look like Eskimos because they are Eskimos. They are Eurasian Nordic people whose ancestors came from Asia. Today you have 40 or 50,000 of them, and it's not Danish. People in Denmark, people in Greenland are not Danish ethnically. They are not Danish geographically. In the 1950s and 60s, Europe decolonized. So France, England, Portugal, Spain, blah, 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 they had to abandon their colonies in the Middle East and North Africa and Africa in the 50s and 60s. The only country in the world which did not decolonize is Denmark. So when they speak about international law and the respect of the free will of the citizen, it's a big lie. It's propaganda.
Interesting. So with a 10% tariff set for February the 1st and an increase to 25% in June, is there a specific deal structure that the U.S. is looking for, or is this an all or nothing demand for full sovereignty?
I think it's psychological warfare. So it's two things. On the one hand, it's psychological warfare. And on the other hand, it is the weaponization of trade and finance and commerce, like the Chinese are doing. So basically, it's true Trump, you could say, is cynical, he's cold, he's calculating, he's brutal, and he's using law, he's using commerce as a weapon. But the Chinese are doing exactly the same every day. And when they can do it, the French and the German and the British do the same. But guess what? Because they are declining, because the British and the French and the Germans are declining powers, they can no longer flex the muscles. So they can no longer play the game that the Chinese and the Americans are playing. And therefore, they say, oh, that game is very dirty. How dare you weaponize trade? How dare you weaponize international commerce? But the Brits and the French and the Germans have been doing it for 200 years. They have invented it. The reason why they weaponize, the Europeans today are less capable of weaponizing trade and international law is because they are weaker, not because they have purer or higher moral ethics. But if you listen to them, it's because they operate on a higher moral or ethical plane. It is a lie.
So by threatening tariffs on NATO partners, is Washington weaponizing trade to achieve territorial goals here?
In a way, yes. But NATO itself is irrelevant, because what is the key to success in finance, in management, in business? And let's remember the people in the White House, for the first time since the days of Theodore Roosevelt, so for the first time in the past 120 years, they come from the world of management, industry, or finance. So they have a very efficient worldview. What does it mean? They're focused. They know the only way for America to withstand the shock and to try to compete efficiently and successfully with China, the only way is to be focused, ultra-focused. What does it mean? It means they believe the center of the world is really the Asia-Pacific area, and they have to protect their home turf. What is their home turf? Is the Americas. The Americas stretching from Chile to Quebec, including Venezuela. That needs to be sanctuarized, and they have to attack or compete aggressively with China in the Asia-Pacific area. So they have to be focused. And when you focus on that aggressively, what do you have to do? You have to abandon Europe, because Europe is becoming irrelevant. The strategic value of NATO, so the reason why NATO, we say raison d'être. What is raison d'être? The reason for being, why was NATO invented? It's not Macron or the British government who invented NATO. It is America. So NATO is a creature of America, and they invented it in 1946, 47, because back then the strategic focus of America was Eurasia, and they needed to protect Western Europe from Soviet Russian aggression. Today the world changed. There's no, there's things, and that because the world changed, the Americans are adjusting. Yes, brutally. Yes, they are doing so in a very abrupt way, and it's hurting the feelings of Ursula von der Leyen and Emmanuel Macron, but that's life.
So how serious is the risk that this becomes the deepest transatlantic rupture in decades?
Well, you said the word, transatlantic. That, and NATO means North Atlantic Treaty Organizations, right? And it means that Western Europe, Britain, Iceland, Denmark, Sweden, they have lost their strategic value in the eyes of America. Maybe they have strategic value in the eyes of the French and the British, But can the French and the British replace America? The short answer is no. So that transatlantic, across, across the Atlantic, trans means across, that relation, its value is now diminished. But if you listen to the Prime Minister here in London, every time he makes a speech, he speaks about the special relationship between Washington and London. That is not true. There is no longer anything special about the relationship between Washington or London or Washington and Paris. And that's the new reality. But of course,
Or
the Europeans,
Germany
or
together.
Germany, but the Europeans are having a hard time adjusting mentally to that new reality,
To the new reality.
The age of geoeconomics.
Yes, yes. Well, that was Mr. Meher Nicholas Fursley, Director of the EU ASEAN Center. Thank you so much, sir, for your valuable insights and enjoyable discussion. While Ukraine's shiver in blacked out cities, its neighbors, or rather its negotiators, sit across from Trump's envoys in Miami seeking peace as mutual pounds energy grids, seizes territory in Donetsk and Zaporizhia, and threatens nuclear-linked infrastructure. The Sunday Times has reported that Russia is rapidly rebuilding its military. Despite massive losses, experts warn that Moscow could threaten NATO borders by 2026, creating a long-term strategic crisis for Europe. Meanwhile, Ukraine is defying the winter blitz using solar power and mini-grids. Citizens have transformed old Soviet blocks into resilient energy fortresses that stay warm during blackouts. This is a war of willpower. So from high-tech defenses to community solar, Ukraine's decentralized survival strategy proves that local innovation can defeat strategic strikes. A true masterclass in modern resistance. According to the Moscow Times, massive power cuts have hit southern Ukraine. Over 200,000 homes are in the dark after alleged Ukrainian strikes on the energy grid. This highlights a new phase where Kiev is heading back at critical infrastructure. Meanwhile, Russia continues its mission, forcing Ukraine to declare a national energy emergency. As temperatures drop, both sides are now targeting the essential systems that keep cities running and people warm. To provide more analysis, joining us from Kiev is Mr. Peter Dickinson, expert at Atlas Center for Studies. Welcome, sir, to Qnews. Mr. Dickinson, let me start by asking you, can peace talks in Miami succeed while Russia bombs Ukraine's power grid and seizes territory in Donetsk and Zaporizhia?
Yeah, absolutely. The talks in Miami are not between Ukraine and Russia. So Russia's actions, the latest war crimes that we're seeing in Ukraine do not really impact the talks, essentially. The talks are between the Trump administration and the Ukrainian government. So it's really all about aligning the US and Ukrainian positions in order to then present to the Russians a united front. It's not about finding the final terms of a peace deal. Obviously, that will need to involve Russia. That's obvious, I would say, essential. But the key at the moment, the objective, I think both for Washington and for Ukraine, is to get that unity, to get that agreement so that they then can go to Russia and say, look, this is what we think is a reasonable format for peace terms. This is what the Americans are prepared to support. And then to begin the next stage of negotiations from that. And what we're hearing from both the American and Ukrainian sides is they're moving closer to that consensus. They're getting closer to a point where they have agreement on, in particular, American security guarantees for Ukraine after a peace settlement or at least a ceasefire, what that would look like and what America's prepared to commit to. So that's certainly a key thing from the Ukrainian side. Once they get to that point, I think we're going to hear a lot more about this in the coming week during the World Economic Forum in Davos. We may even see some documents signed between Zelensky and Trump. Certainly that's going to be high on the agenda. So at this point, the messaging we're getting from Kyiv is very much that they are moving forward with those talks. They're closer to an agreement with the Americans on their united position. But of course, the big talks are still ahead of us. It's going to be all about Russia's position and also what America will do once, as expected, Russia rejects this proposal.
Yes. Well, does the Trump-backed channel with Kushner and Witkoff signal a real diplomatic breakthrough or just political theater ahead of Davos, as you mentioned, the upcoming event in Davos?
Well, President Trump has kind of privatized U.S. foreign policy. You know, the State Department, which has always led on U.S. foreign policy traditionally, has been sidelined to a significant degree, not entirely, but largely. Instead, Trump much prefers to work with his own personal envoys, basically his trusted associates, so Witkoff and his own son-in-law. So I think the fact that they are now leading the talks, although it's a very unorthodox approach, very unusual, very beyond the usual realms of diplomacy, it does indicate that from Trump's perspective, you know, in the new Trump world, this is actually a serious approach. This does signal that he is serious about this, perhaps more so than if he had the U.S. diplomats and the Secretary of State working on it themselves. So probably, it's probably a positive sign.
Is Ukraine's warning about Russian strikes on nuclear-linked infrastructure credible? And what would such an attack mean for global security?
Well, I think it will be very, very reckless to rule anything out at this stage. We're already seeing the Russians are carrying out mass bombardment of Ukraine's energy sector with a very clear intention to freeze millions of people, perhaps to death, certainly to break their morale and to break the country's resistance. So it's difficult to rule anything out. Of course, so far, the Russians have been quite cautious about direct attacks or even indirect attacks, as being suggested here, on Ukraine's nuclear power plants. They've been the only element of Ukraine's energy system that has been relatively unscathed. There have been some attacks on aspects of the nuclear power, particularly the connecting areas, substations, and so on. But this would be an escalation, and it could cause collapses. As far as I'm aware, it could bring into question the further operation of Ukraine's nuclear power plants. They have a number still in operation, a number of reactors, and obviously, the memory of Chernobyl looms large here. That was the largest nuclear disaster in world history, I believe, certainly in European history. And it spread, the impacts from Chernobyl in 1986 in Ukraine spread all across Europe and lasted for decades. So if we're talking now about not just one reactor, but potentially a large number, potentially more than a dozen, the scope is very large for, and it goes well beyond the boundaries of Ukraine, which I think is the key factor here. It's not just about harming Ukraine, it's about a threat to Europe and actually, in fairness, to Russia as well itself.
Well, with Europe cracking down on Russian shadow fleets and NATO scrambling jets over the Baltics, is the continent edging towards direct confrontation, in your opinion?
No, I struggle to believe that Europe is moving in that direction, that Europe would actually countenance or would be ready for direct confrontation. I think if everything we look at over the past 4 years of Russia's invasion, all the signals we see from Europe is that they are excessively cautious, that they're very, very concerned about escalation, that their whole approach to, their whole response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been defined by trying to manage any escalation, to try and avoid escalation. So the idea that they are now looking to escalate seems rather far-fetched. I think what's happening on the contrary is here, they're simply seeing from the actions of the Americans, especially in terms of the shadow fleet, they're seeing from America's actions that Russia's actually a lot weaker than they thought, and the risk of escalation is much lower. So I think they've found their courage, as it were, or been encouraged to be bolder in relation to Russia's shadow fleet, because they've seen from the American actions that Russia essentially is toothless here. It will back down, and as we've seen so far, the Russians have backed down.
So are Russia's recent gains in, let's say, Pervilia and Priluki tactical wins, or part of a strategy to force Kiev into concessions at the negotiating table?
No, there have been no gains from the Russian side recently that would suggest any shift in the broader outlook on the battlefield. I think, frankly speaking, I mean, we're talking about very small territories here. Russia has gained, a village here or there, a field here or there. Ukraine has also made certain tactical advances along the front lines, but neither side has made any major breakthroughs. Going back, and you could arguably go back a few years. So last year, Russia was on the offensive, was advancing throughout the whole year, and overall they managed to gain. I think the most conservative estimate, or the most favourable for Russia, was around 0.7% of Ukraine's territory. So very, very small gains in the broader context of the war, and certainly nothing approaching a decisive breakthrough. So at the moment, of course, the fighting is still very severe. I wouldn't want to downplay it. There's still very, very heavy fighting along the front lines and heavy casualties. But we're not seeing anything, I think, that would indicate that there's anything looking like a potentially large-scale breakthrough that could really change the calculus in either Moscow or Kiev.
Yes. Speaking of calculus, can Ukraine afford to make any peace deal while its cities freeze and hospitals ration electricity under relentless winter strikes?
Well, certainly at the moment, the emphasis for Ukraine is survival. The country is facing a very serious threat in these next few weeks of a humanitarian catastrophe. The temperatures at the moment in Kiev are around -15. They're forecast to drop even further next week, to perhaps down to -20. That's the same across the country, give or take. And we have millions of people who have neither heat nor electricity nor power. So this is, we are talking about a potentially catastrophic scenario here of people freezing, a very serious loss of life, depopulation, and so on. So yeah, at the moment, that's obviously the country's priority. We have a state of emergency declared, and it's quite likely, it's assumed, in fact, we're going to see further Russian airstrikes in the coming days as Putin tries to push home this attack on the civilian population. He tries to gain, to weaponize winter, as they say, to gain advantage while the cold snap is on and while the weather is, Arctic and so cold here, so he can really terrorize the Ukrainian population. That's the priority now. But I don't think there's not going to be any peace deals on the table in the next few weeks. I think we're still a long way away from the point where Ukraine's government or the Ukrainian people will have to make any serious decisions about what sort of peace they're ready to accept. So I think at the moment it's all about Ukraine just trying to survive and trying to protect the civilian population.
I want to quote something you said in the world of Trump, or under Trump's world. How does this unconventional U.S. diplomacy differ from traditional Western support, and does it even risk sidelining NATO or the European Union?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it differs fundamentally. I mean, he differs in terms of his priorities, in terms of his interests, and certainly in terms of his actions and the way he handles things. I mean, the fluctuations in America's position, the way that he just throws things out via social media that have a sort of seismic impacts on the international community and on Europe. It's something that nobody has ever seen before, and probably will never see again, I would imagine, frankly. I mean, it just seems to be a very exceptional set of circumstances that Trump is a very exceptional politician. Certainly, his actions have, I would say, raised very serious questions about NATO. Nobody in Europe wants to come out and say it, certainly no political leaders, but I would be very surprised if anyone in London or Paris or Brussels or Berlin was genuinely confident now that America under Trump would live up to its collective security commitments under NATO. I think that now is something that nobody can take for granted, and that was something that people took for granted for decades. That was always there, the idea that America would be there for Europe, that America would lead NATO. I don't think that's there anymore. So fundamentally, Europeans have got to think about how they're going to manage their security going forward, and they've got to understand that they can no longer rely on America.
Yes. Well, that was Mr. Peter Dickinson, expert at Atlas Center for Studies. Thank you so much, sir, for your special insights and, of course, your valuable discussion. From Miami's high-stakes talks to Kiev's frozen streets, and from Arctic standoffs to nuclear brinkmanship, diplomacy races against destruction. As winter deepens and alliances strain, one question echoes: can peace take root while the bombs still fall? I'm Hala Al-Hamalawi. Thank you so much for watching, and stay tuned for more updates here on Q News.